Captain Marcus Thorne stood like a statue at the palace gates, his steel armor gleaming under the morning sun. For 23 years he had served as the head of the royal guard, and in all that time he had never bent his knee to anyone except the king himself. His reputation was legendary throughout the kingdom, a man who could not be bought, threatened, or swayed by any force on earth. The other guards whispered stories about him in hushed tones. They spoke of how he once refused a chest of gold from a corrupt duke who wanted special treatment. They remembered the day he turned away the queen's own brother, when the man arrived drunk and demanded entry to the royal chambers. Even the king's most trusted advisors knew better than to try ordering Marcus around. He answered to the crown, and the crown alone. Marcus had built his entire life around this simple principle. His father had been a royal guard before him, and his grandfather too. The Thorne family had protected the royal bloodline for 3 generations, and Marcus wore that legacy like armor around his heart. He had no wife, no children, no interests outside his duty. The palace walls were his world, and his oath was his religion. The kingdom respected him for this unwavering loyalty, but they also feared him. Nobles would cross to the other side of corridors when they saw him approaching. Servants would hurry past without making eye contact. Even seasoned knights felt nervous under his steel-gray gaze. Marcus preferred it this way. Fear meant respect, and respect meant order. But on this particular Tuesday morning, something felt different in the palace. There was an unusual energy in the air, a sense of anticipation that Marcus couldn't quite place. The king had been in meetings all week with foreign ambassadors, and the queen had been busy planning some sort of celebration. The 2 older princesses, now grown women with their own households, had returned home for the occasion. Marcus watched from his post as servants hurried back and forth across the courtyard, carrying flowers and decorations. He noticed the kitchen staff working longer hours, and the stable boys grooming the horses with extra care. Whatever was happening, it was important enough to set the entire palace into motion. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself thinking about the youngest princess, Isabella. Unlike her sisters, she was still just 16, with soft brown curls and eyes that seemed to hold an old soul's wisdom. She was different from the rest of the royal family, quieter, gentler, always carrying books instead of jewelry. While her sisters attended grand balls and political meetings, Isabella spent her time in the palace gardens or the library, often alone with her thoughts. The other guards sometimes joked that Princess Isabella was invisible. She moved through the palace like a whisper, never demanding attention or causing any trouble. Marcus had been protecting her since she was born, yet he could count on one hand the number of times she had actually spoken to him. She would nod politely when she passed his post, sometimes offer a small smile, but that was all. Not that Marcus minded. In his experience, the royals who talked the most usually caused the most problems. Princess Isabella's quiet nature made his job easier. She never threw tantrums, never demanded to go anywhere dangerous, never brought unsuitable suitors around. She was in many ways the perfect royal to guard, present but undemanding, important but uncomplicated. As evening approached, Marcus prepared for the changing of the guard. His replacement would take the night shift, and Marcus would return to his small quarters in the guard tower. It was a routine he had followed for over 2 decades, as reliable as the sunrise. But as he stood there, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the palace towers, Marcus had no idea that tomorrow would bring a moment that would challenge everything he believed about duty, loyalty, and the true meaning of strength. The youngest princess, the one everyone seemed to forget, was about to teach him a lesson that would change not just his life, but his entire understanding of what it meant to serve. The next morning brought chaos to the palace. Marcus arrived at his post before dawn, as always. But instead of the usual calm atmosphere, he found servants running in all directions with panic written across their faces. The head butler, normally a composed man who never showed emotion, was wringing his hands and speaking in urgent whispers to anyone who would listen. Marcus stopped a young maid who was hurrying past with tears in her eyes. "What's happening?" he demanded, his voice sharp with authority. "It's Princess Isabella, sir," the maid stammered. "She's gone missing. Her bed wasn't slept in, and no one can find her anywhere in the palace." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. In all his years of service, he had never lost track of a royal family member. His perfect record was about to be shattered. The king would have his head for this, and rightfully so. Within minutes, the entire royal guard was mobilized. Marcus organized search teams to comb through every room, every corridor, every hidden passage in the massive palace. He sent riders to search the surrounding forests and villages. He questioned every servant, every guard, every person who might have seen the princess the night before. But Princess Isabella had simply vanished. The king's rage was terrible to behold. He shouted at Marcus in the throne room, his face red with fury and worry. "How could you let this happen?" he demanded. "She's just a child. Anything could have happened to her." Marcus stood at attention, accepting the king's anger without flinching. He deserved every harsh word. This was his failure, his shame. For the first time in his career, he had let his guard down, and now the youngest princess was missing, possibly in danger. "Find her," the king commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Find her, or don't bother coming back." As the hours passed, Marcus pushed his men harder than ever before. They searched abandoned buildings, questioned travelers on the main roads, and followed every possible lead. But the princess seemed to have disappeared like morning mist. It was late afternoon when Marcus finally found her. He had decided to check the old tower on the east side of the palace, a place that hadn't been used in years. The stairs were crumbling, and most people avoided it because of rumors that it was haunted. But Marcus was desperate, willing to look anywhere. He climbed the narrow, winding staircase, his armor clanking against the stone walls. At the very top, he found a small wooden door that stood slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped into a circular room filled with dusty sunlight. Princess Isabella sat on the floor near a tall window, surrounded by birds. Dozens of them, sparrows, robins, even a few colorful parrots that must have escaped from the royal aviaries. They perched on her shoulders, nested in her hair, and ate seeds from her open palms. She was talking to them in soft, gentle tones as if they were old friends. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, not sure what to do. He had expected to find the princess in distress, perhaps injured or trapped. Instead, she looked more peaceful than he had ever seen her. "Princess," he said carefully, not wanting to startle the birds, "everyone is looking for you. The king is very worried." Isabella looked up at him with those wise, gentle eyes. She didn't seem surprised to see him. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm sorry for causing trouble. I just needed some time to think." Marcus stepped into the room, and surprisingly, the birds didn't fly away. They simply watched him with bright, curious eyes. "Think about what, Your Highness?" Isabella was quiet for a long moment, gently stroking a small sparrow that had settled in her lap. "About my future," she said finally. "Father wants to arrange a marriage for me to a prince from the northern kingdom. They're announcing it tomorrow." Marcus understood now. The celebration preparations, the foreign ambassadors, the sense of anticipation in the palace. It had all been leading to this. Princess Isabella was to be married off to strengthen political alliances, just like her sisters before her. "I don't want to marry someone I've never met," Isabella continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to leave home and live in a cold foreign land where nobody knows me. But I also don't want to disappoint father or cause problems for our kingdom." Marcus found himself in unfamiliar territory. His job was to protect the royal family's bodies, not their hearts. He didn't know how to handle tears or fears or the quiet desperation in a young girl's voice. Marcus cleared his throat awkwardly. "Your Highness, we should return to the palace. Your father is sending search parties throughout the kingdom." Isabella nodded slowly, but she didn't move. A small bluebird had perched on her head, and she was careful not to disturb it. "Captain Marcus," she said, her voice still soft, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, Princess. Have you ever wanted something different than what was expected of you?" The question caught Marcus off guard. Nobody had ever asked him about his wants or desires. His entire life had been about duty and obligation. I serve the crown, Your Highness. That is my purpose." "But before you became a royal guard," Isabella pressed gently, "when you were young like me, did you ever dream of doing something else?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. The truth was, he had once dreamed of other things. As a boy, he had wanted to be a blacksmith like his uncle, creating beautiful swords and tools instead of just carrying them. He had wanted to travel beyond the kingdom's borders, to see the ocean and the great mountains he had only heard about in stories. But those dreams had been put aside the day he took his oath as a guard. "Dreams are luxuries, Princess," he said finally. "Some people are born to dream. Others are born to serve. Isabella looked at him with such sadness that Marcus felt something twist in his chest. "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard," she whispered. The birds around them seemed to sense the change in mood. They chirped softly, as if trying to comfort both the princess and the stern captain who stood guard over her. "Your Highness," Marcus said, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Marriage to the northern prince would secure peace for thousands of people. Sometimes we must sacrifice our personal happiness for the greater good. "Is that what you did?" Isabella asked. "Sacrificed your happiness for the greater good?" Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't answer. The question cut too deep, touched on truths he had buried so long ago that he had almost forgotten they existed. Isabella stood up carefully, letting the birds settle on nearby perches. She walked to the window and looked out over the kingdom spread below them. "I've been watching you for years, Captain Marcus," she said. "Every day you stand at that gate like a stone statue. You never smile, never laugh, never seem to enjoy anything. You're the loneliest person in the entire palace." Her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "I am not lonely," he said stiffly. "I have my duty." "Duty isn't the same as companionship," Isabella replied. "And following orders isn't the same as living." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. Who was this child to lecture him about life? She had grown up in luxury, never wanting for anything, never having to make the hard choices that came with real responsibility. "You don't understand the weight of real duty, Princess. You don't know what it means to carry the lives of others on your shoulders." Isabella turned from the window to face him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. "You're right," she said. "I don't understand your kind of duty, but I understand something else. I understand that a life without choice isn't really a life at all. It's just existing." The room fell silent except for the soft sounds of the birds. Marcus stood there, his armor suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had before. This 16-year-old girl had seen through all his carefully constructed walls in just a few minutes of conversation. She had looked at his life and seen it for what it really was, empty, rigid, and profoundly lonely. But admitting that would mean admitting that everything he had built his identity around was wrong. And Marcus wasn't ready for that kind of truth. "We need to go back," he said firmly. "Your father will send the entire army to look for you if we don't return soon." Isabella nodded. But as she began to gather the seeds she had been feeding to the birds, she said something that would echo in Marcus's mind for days to come. "Captain Marcus," she said quietly, "what if there was a way to serve the crown and still be human? What if duty didn't have to mean giving up every piece of yourself?" Marcus didn't answer, but as they began the long walk down the crumbling stairs, her question followed them like a shadow. The return to the palace was met with relief and celebration. The king embraced his daughter with tears in his eyes. The queen fussed over her like a mother hen, and the servants buzzed with gossip about where the princess had been hiding. Marcus reported that he had found her safe in the old tower, leaving out the details of their conversation. But that night, alone in his quarters, Marcus found himself unable to sleep. Isabella's words kept circling through his mind like persistent echoes. What if duty didn't have to mean giving up every piece of yourself? For 23 years, he had never questioned his path. He woke up, put on his armor, stood at his post, and went to bed. Day after day, year after year, the routine had been enough. It had given his life structure and meaning. But now, for the first time, he found himself wondering if structure and meaning were the same thing. He thought about the young man he had been before taking his oath. That person felt like a stranger now. Someone he had buried so deep that he could barely remember what his dreams had felt like. When had he stopped being a person and started being just a function? The next morning brought the formal announcement of Princess Isabella's engagement. The great hall was filled with nobles, diplomats, and foreign dignitaries. Marcus stood at his usual post near the throne, watching as the northern prince was introduced to the court. Prince Aldrich was handsome enough, with blonde hair and blue eyes that sparkled when he smiled. He was polite, well-educated, and seemed genuinely honored to be marrying into the royal family. By all appearances, he would make a suitable husband for the princess. But Marcus noticed things others missed. He saw how Princess Isabella's hands trembled slightly when she curtsied to her future husband. He saw the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. He noticed how she stood just a little too far away from the prince, maintaining a careful distance even during the formal presentation. After the ceremony, there was a grand feast. Marcus remained at his post, but he could see Isabella at the high table, picking at her food while the prince talked animatedly beside her. She nodded politely at appropriate moments, but Marcus could see the sadness she was trying so hard to hide. During a lull in the festivities, Isabella excused herself from the table. Marcus watched as she walked slowly toward the palace gardens, her heavy silk dress rustling against the marble floors. Without thinking, he found himself following her. He found her sitting on a stone bench beside the fountain, staring up at the stars. She didn't seem surprised to see him approach. "Shouldn't you be at your post, Captain?" she asked quietly. "I should be," Marcus admitted, "but I wanted to make sure you were safe." Isabella smiled sadly. "I'm as safe as I'll ever be. Tomorrow I'll be officially engaged to a man I met 3 hours ago. In 6 months I'll be married and living in a country where I don't know anyone. I'll be perfectly safe and completely miserable." Marcus sat down beside her on the bench, something he had never done in all his years of service. It felt strange to be sitting next to a member of the royal family as an equal, rather than standing guard over them. "Prince Aldrich seems like a good man," Marcus offered. "He is," Isabella agreed. "He's kind and intelligent and everything a princess should want in a husband. But he's not what I would choose for myself, if I had a choice." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sound of water from the fountain and the distant music from the feast. Finally, Isabella spoke again. "Captain Marcus, do you remember what I asked you yesterday? About wanting something different than what was expected of you?" "Yes, I've been thinking about that conversation, and I realized something." She turned to look at him directly. "You and I aren't so different. We're both trapped by other people's expectations, you by your sense of duty and me by my birth." Marcus felt that uncomfortable twist in his chest again. "It's not the same thing, Princess. I chose my path, did you?" Isabella asked gently. "Or did you just follow the path your father and grandfather laid out for you? When was the last time you made a choice based on what you wanted, rather than what was expected?" Marcus opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, because when he really thought about it, he couldn't remember the last time he had made a choice that was truly his own. "I see the way you watch the world, Captain," Isabella continued. "When you think no one is looking, I see you staring at the horizon like you're wondering what's out there. You're curious about things beyond these palace walls, but you've convinced yourself that curiosity is a weakness." Marcus felt exposed, as if she could see straight through his armor to the man he had tried so hard to bury. "Curiosity doesn't protect the kingdom," he said. "Maybe not," Isabella agreed. "But it makes life worth living. And isn't a life worth living the very thing we're trying to protect?" Her question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Marcus had spent his entire adult life believing that sacrifice was the highest form of service, that giving up personal happiness was the price of honor. But what if he had been wrong? What if there was another way? The weeks following the engagement announcement passed in a blur of wedding preparations. The palace was transformed into a hive of activity, as seamstresses worked on the princess's dress, cooks planned elaborate feasts, and diplomats arranged details for the ceremony that would unite two kingdoms. Marcus watched it all from his post, but something had changed inside him since that night in the garden. Isabella's words had planted a seed of doubt that grew stronger each day. He found himself questioning things he had never questioned before. Why did duty have to mean emptiness? Why did service require the complete sacrifice of self? Why had he accepted that his life was worth less than his job? He began to notice things he had ignored for years. The way the sunrise painted the palace walls in shades of gold and pink, the sound of children laughing in the village beyond the gates, the smell of bread baking in the palace kitchens, simple pleasures that had always been there, waiting for him to pay attention. He also began to really see Princess Isabella during these final weeks before her wedding. She went through all the motions required of a royal bride-to-be. She stood for dress fittings, attended meetings with wedding planners, and made polite conversation with her future husband during his visits. But Marcus could see the light slowly fading from her eyes. She was disappearing just like he had disappeared all those years ago when he first put on his armor. The thought made him angry in a way he didn't fully understand. 3 days before the wedding, Marcus was standing guard outside the royal chambers when he heard raised voices from within. The king and queen were arguing, which was unusual enough to make him pay attention. "She's miserable, William," the queen was saying. "Anyone with eyes can see it. Our daughter is dying inside and we're forcing her to smile through it. This marriage will secure our borders for a generation, the king replied firmly. Isabella understands her duty to the kingdom. Understanding duty and accepting it are two different things, the queen shot back. When did we become the kind of parents who value political alliances over our daughter's happiness? When we became rulers of a kingdom with enemies on three sides, the king said. You think I enjoy this? You think I want to send our youngest child to live in a foreign land? But sometimes being a leader means making impossible choices. Marcus heard footsteps approaching the door and quickly resumed his statue-like stance. The queen emerged from the chambers, her face flushed with anger and worry. She paused when she saw Marcus, and for a moment, they looked at each other with a shared understanding. Captain Marcus, she said quietly. You've been watching over Isabella since she was born. Have you noticed how unhappy she's been? Marcus hesitated. Speaking honestly might be seen as overstepping his bounds, but he couldn't bring himself to lie to a mother worried about her child. Yes, Your Majesty. I have. The queen's shoulders sagged slightly. I was afraid you'd say that. She looked down the corridor toward Isabella's chambers. Keep an eye on her, will you? I'm worried she might do something desperate. As if summoned by their conversation, Princess Isabella appeared at the end of the hallway. She was dressed simply, in a plain blue dress that made her look younger than her 16 years. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Mother, she said as she approached, I was hoping to speak with you and father together. The queen exchanged a worried glance with Marcus. Of course, dear. Come in. Marcus resumed his post outside the door, but he couldn't help overhearing the conversation that followed. Isabella's voice was steady but quiet as she spoke to her parents. I cannot marry Prince Aldrich, she said simply. The king's voice boomed in response. Isabella, we've discussed this. The marriage contract has been signed. The Northern Kingdom expects— I don't care what they expect, Isabella interrupted, and Marcus was surprised by the strength in her voice. I care about what's right, and it's not right to promise my life to someone when I know I can never love them. Love can grow, the queen said gently. Can it? Isabella asked. Did love grow between you and father, or were you lucky enough to fall in love with the person you were supposed to marry? There was silence from within the chambers. Marcus knew the answer, as did most people in the palace. The king and queen had married for political reasons initially, but they had genuinely fallen in love over the years. Isabella was asking them to gamble her entire future on the hope that she might be equally fortunate. Sometimes, Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger, we have to choose between what's expected of us and what's right. I choose what's right. I cannot and will not marry Prince Aldrich. The argument that followed was intense but brief. The king threatened to confine Isabella to her chambers. The queen pleaded with her to reconsider. But Isabella stood firm, and eventually her parents had no choice but to accept that their youngest daughter was not as compliant as they had believed. When Isabella finally emerged from the chambers, she looked exhausted but also strangely peaceful. She walked past Marcus without seeming to see him. But just as she reached the end of the corridor, she paused and looked back. Captain Marcus, she said softly, could you walk with me to the garden? I have something important to ask you. Marcus looked toward the door of the royal chambers, where he could still hear the king and queen arguing in worried voices. Please, Isabella added, and something in her tone made it impossible to refuse. They walked to the garden in silence, Marcus following a step behind as protocol demanded. But when they reached the fountain where they had talked weeks before, Isabella turned to face him with an expression he had never seen before. There was determination in her eyes, but also something that looked almost like hope. Captain Marcus, she said, her voice clear and steady, I need to ask you to do something that goes against everything you've been taught. Marcus felt his guard go up immediately. Princess, I cannot disobey the king's direct orders. I'm not asking you to disobey anyone, Isabella said. I'm asking you to make a choice. For once in your life, I'm asking you to choose what you believe is right instead of what you've been told is right. The fountain gurgled softly behind them, and somewhere in the distance Marcus could hear the evening bells beginning to chime. The sound reminded him of all the years he had spent listening to those same bells, marking time that had passed without him really living through it. What are you asking me to do? he said quietly. Isabella took a deep breath. I'm leaving, she said. Tonight, after everyone is asleep, I'm going to disappear again. But this time, I'm not hiding in an old tower. I'm leaving the kingdom entirely. Marcus felt his blood turn cold. Princess, that's impossible. It's too dangerous. The roads are full of bandits, and you don't know how to survive outside the palace walls. You're right, Isabella agreed. I don't know how to survive out there alone. That's why I need someone to teach me, someone who knows how to protect people, how to handle danger, how to travel safely. Marcus stared at her, understanding dawning slowly. You're asking me to abandon my post, to give up everything I've worked for, to betray my oath. No, Isabella said firmly. I'm asking you to expand your oath. You swore to protect the royal family. Well, I am part of the royal family, and I'm telling you that staying here will destroy me. If you really want to protect me, you'll help me find a life worth living. Marcus felt the world tilting beneath his feet. Everything he had believed about duty and service was being challenged by this small, determined girl, who saw things more clearly than he ever had. Where would we go? He heard himself asking, and was surprised by his own question. Isabella's eyes lit up with the first real joy he had seen in her in weeks. Anywhere, she said. Everywhere. There's a whole world beyond these walls, Captain. Cities we've never seen, people we've never met, experiences we've never imagined. We could see the ocean, the great mountains, the desert kingdoms in the south. I don't know how to be anything other than a guard, Marcus said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Then learn, Isabella said simply. People change careers all the time. You could be a blacksmith like you once dreamed, or a merchant, or a scholar. You could be anything you want to be. Marcus looked around the garden at the palace walls that had contained his entire adult life. For the first time, those walls looked less like protection and more like a prison. What about your parents? He asked. They'll be heartbroken. Isabella's expression grew sad, but her resolve didn't waver. I'll write to them once we're safely away. I'll explain that this isn't about rejecting them or the kingdom. It's about refusing to sacrifice my life for political convenience. Maybe someday they'll understand. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through all the implications of what she was suggesting. He would be giving up his rank, his reputation, his entire identity. He would be starting over at 43 years old, with nothing but his skills and whatever coin he had saved. But then he thought about the alternative. He thought about watching Isabella marry a man she didn't love, seeing the light disappear completely from her eyes. He thought about standing guard for another 20 years, growing older and lonelier until he became nothing more than a piece of palace furniture. Princess, he said finally, what you're asking, it's not just dangerous for you. I would be branded a traitor, a kidnapper. They would hunt us to the ends of the earth. Isabella stepped closer to him, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. Captain Marcus, she said, I'm not ordering you to come with me. I am asking you, as one human being to another, to help me find freedom. You have spent your entire life following orders. Just this once, I'm asking you to follow your heart instead. Marcus looked into her eyes and saw his own reflection staring back at him. But for the first time in decades, the man in that reflection looked alive. He took off his captain's insignia and placed it carefully on the edge of the fountain. When he straightened up, he was no longer Captain Marcus Thorne, head of the Royal Guard. He was just Marcus, a man who had finally chosen his own path. When do we leave? He asked. Isabella smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise after a long, cold night. At midnight, she said. Pack light and meet me at the old tower. We have a whole world to discover. As they parted ways to prepare for their journey, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in over 20 years. He felt hope. And for the first time in his life, he was about to follow an order he had given himself. The simple, gentle command to choose happiness over duty, life over mere existence, and freedom over the comfortable prison of other people's expectations. The youngest princess had spoken, and Captain Marcus Thorne had finally learned how to listen.